So we formed the Stow Genealogy Club last September, and there's two of us, Priscilla Foss and myself, are co-leaders. We've redefined ourselves. I guess we're no longer co-founders. And we meet once a month on the fourth Tuesday, which is what today is. And in addition to the meetings we have, we also can use the COA bus to go to archives or major libraries. And the one we're working on right now, either May or June, is going to the New England Historic Genealogical Center Society. And so we'll let you know all about that later on. Typically in our monthly meetings, we'll have a presentation either by Priscilla or myself or somebody else for 45 minutes or so. And then we open it up for everybody to talk about what they've been doing, what they've discovered, what they are having problems with. And so we're hoping everybody can move along in their search for their ancestors. So the timing of this, I've got 3 more introductory speakers, and then we'll have the 25-minute film, and then afterwards we'll have a 5-minute break a little bit before 2 o'clock, and we're going to rearrange the tables probably in a circle. We got so many people, it's got to be a massive circle, but we'll try it out. And then I'm going to have a microphone, and I'm asking Marilyn Zaworski to have a microphone, and we're going to be approaching different people to raise their hands, and there's going to be 3 things: people asking questions, people answering the questions, and then we're hoping that some of you will have a story. And one example is Phil Mosley is going to talk about the very large barn that's no longer there at Skip Warren's farm. And different people will say different things. So, Priscilla? Well, I'll come to you.
Just want to let you all know that, as Phil said, we meet on the 4th Tuesday of the month, and so we will be meeting May 28th at 1 o'clock, and we usually meet down in room 122, and we will be talking about our successes or our problems and brick walls. And I plan this month to bring in my laptop and hook it up to the large screen so that we can perhaps see some of the websites that are mentioned. Hope you all can make it, and you're all very, very welcome.
Marilyn? Marilyn's got some comments about the film, and I'll just give it to you.
Okay, I'm Marilyn Zaworski, the Stow Historical Society. When this film was made in 1983, we were living in Western Mass. We came here the following year. So I needed to go into our archives and all our resources to see how Stow developed this whole program for our 300th birthday. And it started in 1980, so it was 3 years in planning. And what I did, and I'll have it out on the back table for you, is I just put together a little binder of just a few of some of the documents. There, I guess that's better. Just showing you the first piece of paper I found, that the planning began in March 1980. So that was just over 3 years. And it goes through the planning, programming for the 82 and 83. It's breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking, just to take a look And I have some pictures from newspapers in here, so it'll be fun for, I think, people to look at it. And then we have this video, which was first a movie, correct? Okay. That was done for this. And when I listened to it, thinking how far back it was, even though 83 does not seem that long ago, as far as history and technology in our records, it really is. And one of the things that struck me, first of all, was when it opened up, it talked about John Cattell and how he was killed in the Indian raids in 1676. And he was not killed. And what was interesting is that the early records were going back to what a sermon was preached in Lancaster, the people who were killed, and the name went down. And it has been disproven. There were actually two John Cattells. There was one in Stow who had land, and they cannot even prove that he ever lived on that land. And there was one who was renting property in Lancaster. And they believe it's the second John Cattell, whose wife was taken for ransom with Mary Rowlandson. It's a fascinating history. I started reading, and I was like 3 hours into it, and I was still mesmerized by it. The video also in the story, they're talking about the Indians. And in 2019, when we talk about the Native Americans, the indigenous people, we have to recall that the history was written by the British, the Puritans. And their thoughts were that the land was for them when they came over here. And so we have to think very carefully when we listen to this and think about this whole era, just what was happening, because the Native American population was being decimated because of the plagues, the different illnesses that the colonists had brought in. Not only the British here, but the ones that came like even 100 years before with the traders that were coming in. Keep in mind that Stow was wilderness. It was the edge of the frontier. Even though we had Sudbury on one side, we had Lancaster on the other, this was total wilderness. And the video will show that. The other thing they talk about is John Green. And we had in Stow a man named John Green, and many people have tried over the many centuries to equate him with William Goff, who was a regicide, because John Green also had been involved in England. He had been in the colonies. He had gone back. He was in Charlestown. He had gone back to fight for Oliver Cromwell. And then when Charles II was crowned the king, he came back to Charlestown. He had land in Charlestown, he had land in Sudbury, he had land in Stow. We can trace him. So when they talk about William Goff and John Green, just remember that they are two separate people. And it's a fascinating, fascinating story. One thing about John Green is when you go to Lower Village Cemetery, we have one stone. It's a big slab of granite. It's called a wolf stone. And it's very rare. When we had in 2015 the ground penetrating radar survey of Lower Village, Bob Perry was just ecstatic when he said, "You people have a wolf stone." And a wolf stone was the very, very early burials. If you had the money to do it, they would put the slab over the burial so the wild animals wouldn't dig it up. And that was 1688. Our first marker that survives in Lower Village is 1711. So John Green was definitely one of the first to be buried in our Lower Village Cemetery. The other thing that was very interesting is that the video talks about all the land that Stow lost. And Stow put up a fight for some of this land. One of the big ones was in Maynard when we lost Our lower village, the Aspet Village in Sudbury, lost a big section also. It was highly contested, and it was an economic hit to the town. We also lost land to Harvard in 1732 and Boxborough in 1783. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I just wanted to, this is the program. If you fold it, says, said Towns of Stow. For when the Stow was first, this was the program that went with when this video was shown during this celebration. So it's a really nice little beginning, but it's way too long to read right now, so we can get on with the program.
Our final speaker before the film is one of the three producers of the film. And a lot of you know Arnie Buckman, and he's going to describe the production and whatever else he wants to say. That's all. Don't change anything.
Okay, first question, how many of you were here for the original presentation in 1983? Very good. I know most of you ladies have gotten 5 years older since then. One of the problems with archiving is that technology changes. The original presentation is actually on a reel-to-reel tape, which is in the town vault. And I doubt that anybody has any equipment that can access it at this time. There is now a copy of this DVD in the town vault, but someday even that will be unplayable due to a lack of playback equipment. This presentation is a history of the town of Stow from its beginnings up until the 300th anniversary of the town in 1683. In the list of credits at the end of the presentation, there are only two of us left. Chris Childs, who currently lives in Minnesota, and myself. And I'm the only one still in Stow. This DVD was the work of three people. Bob Johnson, who lived on Wheeler Road, Stan Sherman, who lived at the end of Treaty Lane, and myself. The script was written by Bob, was narrated by Stan. I think everybody knew Stan Sherman. Photography was supplied by Stan and myself. Stan did most of the interviews, and research was done by all of us. And it was my job to put it together, add background music, and make something that we could show at the 80th anniversary celebration. At the original presentation in 1983, Stan did the narration, and the pictures were shown manually on a carousel slide projector. It was then done again without an audience, so that it could be videotaped with the help of Cablevision. And as we all know, VHS tapes have gone by the wayside, so here's another case where technology ran away on us. I then took it on myself to make a DVD out of it, and this is what we are seeing today. Sit back, relax, and learn about the first 300 years of the town of Stow. And let's see if I can get this going.
The Indians called it Pompasiticate, and at first it belonged to them. It was a forest wilderness that sprawled between the Massachusetts Bay Colony settlements of Concord and Lancaster. Its thick, lush floor supported oak, pine, and elm, and it was rich with game. Hardly 30 years had passed since the landing at Plymouth, when Pompasiticate took its first English settlers. First came Matthew Boone, then John Kettle, then others. And it's said that they traded jackknives and simple tools for land and the right to hunt and fish. For a while it was peaceful. Trade was beneficial to both Indian and settler. And in time, the Massachusetts Bay General Court saw a reason to grant that the place become a village. Lots were laid out and offered only to men of good conversation and orthodox in religion. There came a time, however, when the Indians throughout New England saw clearly they were losing their land, and with it their very survival. And they fought their destiny with fury. Inspired by a Wampanoag chief, whom the settlers called King Philip, tribes throughout New England launched murderous attacks on towns and villages. Pompasiticate was not excluded. Along with others, both Boone and Kettle, the first two settlers in Pompasiticate, were victims of the tomahawk. But the colonists as a whole were of sturdy stock. Not only did they hold ground, but in fact retaliated with remarkable force, killing King Philip in the process. And it was not long thereafter that the Indian spirit began to collapse. Raids and massacres became less fierce, less frequent. The American Indian was dying. With less fear of the tomahawk, English pioneer settlers again were drawn to the richness of this land called Pompasiticate. In early May of the calendar year 1683, inhabitants of the village petitioned the general court for a township. They showed that they had chosen selectmen and a constable, and they asked that a suitable and comely English name be procured. And it was on the 16th day of that same month, May 1683, that the general court responded.
At a general court held at Boston, 16th May, 1683, in answer to the petition of Benjamin Bosworth, Thomas Stebbins, Boaz Brown, and the inhabitants of Pompasiticate, the motion of the Commonwealth thus appoints to order said new plantation between Concord and Lancaster. The court doth grant the plans to be a township, and does allow the choice already made by the inhabitants of selectman and constable, and provided that they act nothing contrary to instructions and orders given them by the Commonwealth for the prudent distribution of these lands, and encouragement for the settling of a minister among them, the name of said town be Stow, and they are freed from the county rates for 3 years next ensuing.
In the beginning, it was a time for building homesteads and a meeting house. It was a time for setting aside common land and for bartering corn and grain and sometimes rum for private land on which to grow things. There was no idea of separation of church and state then, and this new township called Stow, being poor from its problems with the Indians, was granted by the provincial treasury 10 English pounds to help support a minister. And the townspeople paid Samuel Hunt 10 bushels of corn to build a meeting house, which of course would also be used as a garrison. When the weather was right, they walked to the meeting house in their bare feet, carrying their shoes and socks so as not to put too much wear and tear on them. There were the Browns, Heels, Stevens, Halls, Freemans, the Davies, Gates, Hapgoods, the Whitneys, Witherbys, the Wheelers, and others. And there was a man who called himself John Green. John Green, an elderly man, a sickly man, a quiet man who stayed mostly to himself, and who, just before he died, asked that he be buried under a headstone with no markings. He said that otherwise there would be those who just would not let him rest in peace. And so it was. He was buried, this John Green, in the lower village cemetery under a plain, unmarked, flat slab of rock, which someday would be given a fair amount of attention by another people of another time. In the early years, Stow had a difficult time getting or keeping ministers. Wives wouldn't come from England with them, or the remoteness was not to their liking. Or perhaps a salary consisting of half money and half grain was not a suitable arrangement. Then one day, Reverend John Eveleth came to town. He was a minister, blacksmith, farmer, and soon to be known as the best fisherman in town. He stayed 17 years.
Well, I think he was a friendly, gregarious soul. People seemed to like him. And there are two stories. One story is that his wife was a scold, and therefore he stayed in the taverns too much. I see this, that he was a friendly soul and enjoyed the conversation at the tavern, and the whole business about his wife. It could go the other way. It could be that because he stayed in the taverns that she was a scold. You could have it either way.
After Eveleth came Reverend John Gardner. He stayed 56 years. He was an intense man, a severe taskmaster with his family, but he was loved and respected by the townspeople. During the Reverend Gardner years, the people of Stow were busy. They grew apples, grew hops for the Boston breweries, sold or gave land to help form the towns of Harvard and Boxborough. They made provisions for the full support of their first pauper, the widow Hughes, and they geared up for and took part in a political revolution, the results of which would change conditions for mankind on the planet Earth forever.
The town meeting in Stow voted resistance to the crown earlier than Acton did by 4 or 5 days. But the town voted to resist the efforts of the crown to tax them. The Minuteman Company was formed under William Whitcomb, and that consisted of 81 men.
The year 1774. Henry Gardner, Reverend Gardner's son, is appointed by Provincial Congress to the position of Massachusetts Bay Treasurer. All taxes are now to be paid to him instead of to the King's Treasurer, Harrison Gray. And Edmund Burke speaks to British Parliament about his view of the colonists.
They seem to me rather ancient nations, grown to perfection through a long series of fortunate events and a train of successful industry, accumulating wealth in many countries than the colonies of yesterday, than a set of miserable outcasts of a few years ago, not so much sent as thrown out on a bleak and barren shore of a desolate wilderness 3,000 miles from all civilized intercourse.
In cosmic time, Burke's speech is hardly finished when Samuel Prescott, a young man in Concord, abruptly finds himself on horseback riding hard for Stow.
He was calling on his girlfriend and was on his way home when he met Paul Revere and Dawes, and coming out to warn the people in the towns out in Concord, to warn Concord that the British were on their way, and the British intercepted Dawes and Revere, but Prescott got away, and Prescott came to Acton and then to Stow to warn Henry Gardner. That was the end of Paul Revere's ride. They responded, and the Stow Minutemen were among the first 10 companies to arrive at the bridge.
1775 was a mixed year for Stow. There was at the same time turmoil and serenity. And there was, of course, the almost all-consuming concern for the Revolution. Then, too, Reverend John Gardner died. He was 80, and Reverend Jonathan Newell took his place. But in spite of the uneasiness of the time, the church was relatively peaceful, except for a town mandate requiring the constable to kill all dogs that entered the meeting house on the Sabbath. The following year, a group of men in Philadelphia signed a document declaring the colonies independent from British rule. And as a result, this township called Stow, now approaching its 100th anniversary, was about to become a town in a new nation. They celebrated their centennial with both sorrow and joy. They had by this time sent 260 men to war, but the British cabinet had agreed to recognize U.S. independence, and the Revolutionary War was over. There was at this time a heightened awareness and respect for freedom and human liberty. It was probably not a coincidence that in 1775, 154 Stow citizens and 3/10 of the town's value were used to form a new town to be called Boxborough, and that the Massachusetts Supreme Court outlawed slavery. Yet 6 years before that court ruling, Joseph Stone of Stow stated publicly his change of attitude on this matter of human liberty.
I, Joseph Stone of Stow, did on the 14th of February, 1776, buy of one Nathaniel Sherman of Boston a Negro man named Yobel to serve me and my heir forever as a servant. Therefore, in consideration of his fidelity and other motives moving me, I have and do hereby discharge and set at liberty from slavery said slave known by the name of Yobel Stone.
During a quarter-century period following the Revolution, they built a town farm for the poor and developed 2 new highways, Great Road and Red Acre Road. And Rufus Hosmer built a fancy place next to Lower Common. And, near a grove of pine on a hill, Abijah Warren built a new homestead that would be called Pilot Grove Farm.
They left that grove of pine on the top of the hill, and it could be seen by ship's captains and pilots bringing ships into Boston Harbor.
1814. The British can't leave it alone. They land at Maryland and burn the U.S. Capitol. Francis Scott Key writes the Star-Spangled Banner, and a young man in Stow receives a greeting.
Massachusetts Militia, to Mr. John Gates. You, being duly enrolled as a soldier in the company of which Asa Whitcomb is commanding officer, are hereby ordered to appear at the usual place of parade of said company in Stow at the meeting house on Saturday the 17th day of September at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, armed and equipped as the law directs, and there wait for further orders. Dated at Stow this 5th day of September, 1814.
Soon after, Stow men form an independent infantry unit called the Washington Guards, and the ladies in town make them a flag. It was 1824, and the whole town was at the lower village common. He was on his way to Bolton, but he'd stop in Stow for a bit. They all wanted to see this man, this General Lafayette.
Lafayette, we know that the freedom we have to build our nation was achieved by assistance, in large part in our desperate hour of need.
Thank you all very much. Those of you who know and truly understand the stories of the war know how precious is this country of yours, which, more than any other nation on the face of the earth, depends for its success on the love and sincerity of its people. My heart is warmed by the cordiality of your welcome, and may God bless you all. Merci.
By the time Stow was a century and a half old, it had given land to Sudbury, Marlborough, Boxborough, Bolton, and Harvard. It had an academy that boarded students not only from town, but also from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Maryland, and Canada. It was an expensive school, cost its proprietors $571.42 to build it, but you had to take into consideration that it included the cost of the land. They also had a new West School where Elmira Whitney was paid $1 a week to teach. It was a healthy wage at the time. And Stow was still a century and a half old when it decided that as a town it would no longer support a minister. Coincidence, no doubt, as anyone would agree, but it was just about 3 short years after that decision that Reverend John Newell passed away. In the mid-1800s, the camera was invented. And just about the same time, Stow built a new town hall. And of course, they took a picture of it. They also took a picture of the new 5-story mill that Messrs. Gleason and Dale built in Rock Bottom to replace the one that had just burned down. And they took a picture of the Brigham Shoe Shop in Rock Bottom, and of Otto Gears, who sailed with Admiral Farragut, and who, after the Civil War, came to Stow to marry the widow Whitman of West Acton Road. As the middle of the 19th century moved on, Stow saw itself giving more acreage to Hudson and giving up 1,300 of its acres to help start a new town to be called Maynard. And in the late 1800s, just about the time they started using horses instead of oxen on the farms, the town reached its 200th anniversary. During Stow's bicentennial year, the town voted to place simple stone markers on the knolls where Matthew Boone and John Kettle had lived. And with remarkable optimism, they planted a tree on the lower village common in hopes that it would be enjoyed by us as we celebrate the town's 300th anniversary. The Haletonian, the Hale High School newspaper, described the local townspeople as
mostly farmers with such numbers of traders, tavern keepers, blacksmiths, and shoemakers as are needed.
Between the bicentennial year and the beginning of the 20th century, a stage hauled passengers and mail between the South Acton train station and Stow Center. Belinda Randall gave the town $25,000 to build a library, and the kids enjoyed sporting new styles occasionally. Spelling bees were popular at the Old West School, and at the close of the century, the U.S. Postmaster General, in response to a petition, changed the name of the Rock Bottom Post Office to Gleasondale. It came in about the turn of the century, and it was a thriller. The seats were as wide as the cars, and the conductor had to edge along the outside rail to collect the fares. It was the Concord, Maynard, and Hudson line, and it ran through Stow, up Great Road, left onto what's now Gleasondale Road, Birch Hill, and on into Hudson, then back again. The Weekly Enterprise, a local paper at the time, described Stow's reaction to the first one.
The citizens of Stow, some of whom had never before seen an electric car, manifested great delight over its unexpected appearance and showed their joy in many ways.
The line was not without its problems, but it provided generally good transportation for a decade or so, until...
The first automobile they ever rode in, I must have been about 10. That must have been around 1914 or 15. Mr. Shaughnessy, who was then the mayor of Marlborough and had lived in Stow, brought up with my dad, he and his wife drove into the yard one day and wanted to know, did we want to go for a ride? And he had a 7-passenger Cadillac, I guess, with a little jump seats. And we rode up to Mount Wachusett, up the winding mountain road, up the mountain, and had a little ice cream at the mountain house and came back. That was something really. That was the first car I ever rode in.
During the early years of the 20th century, Fred Prentice drove the school barge. And the first graders began a tradition, marching in the Memorial Day parade to put flowers on the soldiers' graves. A new school called Hale was built, and the West School was sold to John Taylor for $26. It was used as a residence for the next 50 years. And 77 Stow men went to a world war. Lake Boone was booming with excursion boats and a dance hall, and the Stowaway Inn advertised 3 square meals a day. People heard their first radio broadcasts and saw their first talkies. Tractors replaced horses on the farm. Miss Bird managed Red Acre Farm, a refuge for worn-out workhorses. Jerome Dwinnell delivered mail. Charles Fletcher bought a tannery and turned it into the box mill. The fire and highway departments were organized. A windmill pumped water on Wheeler Road, and Franny Warren was elected town clerk for the first time. The year 1930. 2 men, under the supervision of the Stow Cemetery Commissioner, dig up the remains of John Green. It seems that way back in 1776, Reverend John Gardner had done some research on this John Green. Turned out that there was reason to believe that John Green was really William Gough, who, as an English judge, had ordered the execution of King Charles I. And King Charles II placed a bounty on Gough's head. So, on a hot day in July in 1930, Frank Robbins, Stow Cemetery Commissioner, out of curiosity, sifted through those remains dug up in the lower village cemetery from under that same plain, unmarked flat slab of rock. He composed and signed an affidavit.
We believe the stone had been removed at some time and then replaced. The belief that the grave had been previously opened is further strengthened by the fact that upon opening the grave, we found remains of vertebrae and other bones, including those of the feet, toes, and arms. It is our opinion that the head had been removed, as we found no remains of the same.
The middle years of the 20th century started steaming hot. Another world war. 151 Stow boys went. Not all came back. And then there was Korea and Nam. As the later years of the century approached, Stow got a place to land aircraft. High-tech was around the corner. A shopping center went in. We took the Old West School in lieu of back taxes, and we established a land conservation commission. And once again, we set aside common land, a town forest, a town beach, and so on. And as the fall colors of the 20th century became more vivid, we found ourselves approaching our 300th anniversary. It was once again a time to step back a bit and look. 100 years ago, John Swift asked Stow's citizenry to continue stepping to the music, and step to the music the town has done. Its people have poured their collective energies into the town, the Commonwealth, and the nation. From the outside, it appears that through the generations, much of Stow has changed. And yet from the inside, there remains a powerful kinship to the values of those who were here before us. There remains a love and respect for the land, and there remains a deep appreciation for the delicate balance of self-sufficiency and the art of looking after one another. A town nurse who organizes a mitten tree to warm small, cold hands. A school bus driver who goes off the established route to see that a child does indeed get home safely. Someone who donates anonymously thousands of dollars for a town beach. A town clerk who sees real people as more important than red tape. And town fathers who, giving their time, work into the early morning hours to solve a complex problem. The town is now 300 years old, 100 years older than the nation of which it is a part. We have a reason to be proud of our heritage and the examples our ancestors have set in the development of the Commonwealth and the nation. It is time now to step back a bit and assess our work and continue.
Time has a way of making things fuzzy, but it's great to see this film. And we thank you very much, Arnie, for putting it together way back when. Well, this next section, which will run from right now until 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock we cut off. And I'm asking Marilyn to co-host this section because I moved here, Shirley and I moved here 2 years ago, this month of April. So I don't know the history that Marilyn knows. And
I'm learning.
So we're to pull out of you greatness. So I've asked you, some of you, to think about a story that you can share, but that's only 2 or 3 people. But any of you that have a story that you like to share about your ancestors, or the farmhouse you live in, or it's completely non-scripted. You just chime in. And Skip Warren was here for the meal site, but he has some limitations, so he went home. He's doing fine, but he's, like many of us, we're getting older. And so Phil Mosley has talked with him, and Phil's going to tell a story about the old barn, which is not there. It was part of the Pilot Grove farm. Phil?
Well, seeing and hearing, is this on?
Yeah.
Seeing and hearing Franny's voice reminds us in this room that we could probably spend an afternoon telling Franny stories. Because when a lot of us came to town, Liz and I are new to town. We've only been here 48 years so far. And Franny was one of the first people you ever met when you came to town, because you went to the town clerk and registered. And you either met him at the old town hall or at his house, wherever he happened to be working. So when you first moved here, we lived up on Elliott Drive, and I tried to have a garden, and the animals beat me out of it. So Franny says, "Philip, why don't you come down to my place and you can use a piece of my property?" So I went down there and I used a piece of Franny's property, and it was in a garden spot right next to Franny's. So we'd be out there working away, and the cars would go by and they'd toot the horn, and Franny would ignore them. I said, "Franny, they're talking to you." He says, "Philip, if I stopped and waved at every car, I'd never get any weeding done." So he was a character and just a great person. And we became good friends over the years, and I'm happy that my friendship has continued with Skip. So when I told Skip we were having this session, would he like to send me some information and talk about the barn? Well, he was beside himself with pleasure. So this is what he wrote to me. He says, "Although I do want to join this discussion, I just know it is too much for me. I have to save my energy for the afternoon work in the Red Sheep Barn. Dorothy Sonicson offered to sit next to me and help me, but I will tell her that I do not feel able to attend." So this is what Skip wrote about the big barn. "The big barn was built in 1841 and was 82 feet by 40 feet and 3 stories high, with the cupola and the plow weather vane. The original plow weather vane topped the cupola for 123 years before it was stolen one night. We replaced it with the help of the Collings Foundation, but it was stolen again. We made a third plow replica weather vane, and it tops the Red Sheep Barn cupola, built in 1991. From what my father and grandfather Henry told us, the old barn was originally constructed in an orientation parallel to Strong Water Brook that flows into Minister's Pond. During the early 1860s, the barn was then turned around about 90 degrees and into an east-west position, because the 1821 carriage horse barn was moved to its new location in 1861. The 1821 carriage house was originally a country store operated by Jonas Warren. The 1841 barn housed the cows with a large hayloft above. There was also a silo inside where chopped corn, was stored, and later apple pumice from the Zander cider mill. The Clouds loved the apple pumice. I'm not sure how it might have affected the milk that we delivered and sold in Stow for many years. The main barn entrance floor was often used for high school basketball practice in the 1940s and 1950s. As the barn aged, the powder post beetle bored into the timbers and ate the wood, which weakened the whole structure. We tried to save it, but then we're told the cost was prohibitive, so we made a tough decision to demolish, and this event happened late summer 1994. It is of interest that the 1821 carriage house was built with chestnut wood, which is very hard, and the powder post beetle has not damaged the structure. The big barn was built with white pine and softer woods. This is all I can remember at the moment. Maybe when I wake up around 3 or 4 a.m., I will think of more information. So he must have had a good night. I didn't hear back from him, but if you remember that barn, it was just a magnificent thing. And I remember when they tried to take it down, it was more secure than they thought it was, because the bulldozers worked really hard to take it down. And so that other building is still there, what Skip refers to as the carriage house or the horse barn. And many years ago, Franny had quite a collection of farm tools in there, but it was open to the public. Now with all the insurance rules, it's not possible. So anyway, that's a nice message from Skip.
Thank you, Phil. Before I go to the other story, I'd like to invite people to chime in with comments and questions.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. Bill Mosley has the most beautiful stone wall in Massachusetts. It's part of our heritage that instead of just fretting over things, they took what was on the ground and made something of them. And that stone wall is to dream for.
You can come fix it any day. It's showing its age.
Oh, now you know why I used to like to drive by there and visit you.
Anytime.
Somebody else?
Honeypot?
Okay.
I'm Clifford Martin. My grandfather was Clifford A. Martin. He used to work on his grandfather's farm out in Illinois back in the 1800s. And he became an engineer eventually. He always wanted to get back to farming. He ended up buying Honeypot, which was at the time an old dairy farm that was, this was back in 1926. It was owned, it was built, I guess, the tavern and the inn itself was built back in, I believe, 1811. When he bought it, when he first brought his family out to see it, he couldn't find it. And the two delivery trucks that brought all of their furniture and everything to Stow came from Sudbury, and they stopped at the wooden bridge. It was late in the afternoon, and they didn't dare go across that wooden bridge with those two heavy trucks. So they slept in their trucks overnight. And then what they did the next morning is they said, well, we're going to have to deliver this. So they backed up that hill towards Lake Boone, and then flew across that bridge as fast as they could with the two trucks. Anyway, they made it. It was kind of dilapidated at the time, so my grandfather had to replace all the roofs and everything else. But he continued with his job engineering in Boston. He would catch the train at a train station down where Boone crosses the Assabet River. There's a station right there. So he'd get up around 4 o'clock in the morning and feed the animals and bring in the eggs and milk the cows, catch the 6 o'clock train, go into Boston, come back out at 6 o'clock, go back again and milk the cows, and if there was any daylight, he'd start planting some apples. And again, it was a dairy farm, and he was trying to convert it to an apple farm. So He worked in Boston until the Depression, then he was laid off for a while. Then after the Depression, he went back to engineering. So he continued working in Boston while trying to develop the orchards up until the early 1950s. So eventually it went from a 77-acre farm to now 100 acres of just plain fruit, plus another 80 acres of parking areas and ponds and so on and so forth. My grandfather passed away, and the farm went to my Uncle Richard. And then my Uncle Richard eventually passed away, and the farm went to Andrew and his daughter Julie. Andrew bought out Julie, and right now Andrew owns the farm, and he's working with his daughter Chelsea in the store. So it's now actually 4 generations and about 93 years old. So we've been around a little while, but not as long as many of the families here in Stow. But the Martins do go way back. If you trace the Martin family, they go back to Illinois, where my grandfather came from, Williamstown for about 4 generations, Connecticut for about 2 or 3 generations, and then Ipswich, Massachusetts for about 2 generations, back to the early 1600s. So that's a little bit about Honeypot.
Thank you, Cliff Martin. I'm not sure if you said it, but your grandfather's name was? No. Grandfather, grandson, Honeypot Farm. Who's next? Okay. Hold this.
Yeah. The other side is the important side. Right at this moment, we are again working on restoring the town hall. And the last time it was restored, a bunch of men in this town sacrificed a lot of their free time to work on it. There's only one of the crew was here today, and that blue over there. And when they finished, the Historical Society framed this picture and presented it to all of them. So what I do to all my paintings is put a story on the back of it, so that when my kids go through the stuff, they're not going to say, why did she keep it? When they take it off the wall, they're going to see why I kept it. I think this makes Stow what Stow is. People in Stow have always worked to save things and work to improve things, and newcomers have usually been drawn into it in spite of themselves. And this thing tells these men. Now these are ordinary, everyday men, and they are working in a hot summer day in the town hall with no air conditioning and very little amenities, and they were having a good time doing it. So the Historical Society took pictures of paper, printed it, and these guys, some of them are not with us anymore. But Lou Halpern was on the committee, and he and my husband had a great time because Lou tried to bring a little California to Stow, and my husband used to say, this is not California. This is Massachusetts. But he worked very hard for it. So the list of the people on here, and I'll leave it so you can see it. Ernie Dodd, whom all of you must know because he's continuing to work for us. He did a lot of restoring in the end, and he made himself a valuable person to Bobby Head because he put a step at the end of the platform with a rail so she wouldn't break her neck. All of them contributed. My husband, Newell, would get up in the morning at 5, do his retirement job, which was to be the janitor of 3 of the town buildings. The library, the town hall and the town office building. And I would say with much pride that he's the only person in the town who ever got the key to his office from Bill Wrigley. And then George Gregg, who was the building inspector at the time, and Rich Pepper, they take time from the work. And they didn't mention Wayne Fletcher, who got up on the ladder on the inside on the hottest days of the summer and painted the building. We didn't spend a lot of money doing that, but we spent a lot of energy. And I think that's what makes the town of Stow very special, that the people are still willing to work for it, physically, mentally, financially, and they're restoring town building again. And that's why I thought that I would bring this today, so you can see we're going to continue to be a pretty darn good town.
Is that frame sturdy enough to pass around?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Daisy. Lou, are you from California?
Amongst other prices.
Oh, I see. Well, we all read your column in the paper, and I'm sure you have plenty of stories. Do any of them come to mind?
Is this one working? See, the movie that we saw today, one of the people that put that together, Stan Sherman, who I got to know quite well. It started off when my coming from California and getting used to Stow, and was curious about what this thing was called, the town meeting. So I got over to get to one that was scheduled. It wasn't in the town hall because it was much too big by that time to fit in the hall. So they were over in the gym at Center School, a fairly new gym at that time. And I got up over there, found out where it was, sat down, and I saw this guy up front struggling to put up some speakers and a microphone. And it was Stan Sherman, who I didn't know, but I've had some background with electronics and so forth, and decided to go up and help him with the wires and the plugs. And he accepted that quite well. But by the end of the meeting, when I helped him take things down, he congratulated me for being the new person in town in charge of the town system, sound systems. That's the way Stan was. He always got people to help and then turned it over to them. The same thing happened when we both got involved in doing some video work, which was just new in Stow. Stan was one of those curious enough to borrow cameras and play with it. He got me interested in it, and you know where that went. Stan isn't with us, but Stow TV is, and I see him all the time in the work that's done there. So that's my story.
And you're going to stick to it. Yes.
And is this working? Yeah. What I was going to say is I had a little dance for the tercentenary, and you're talking about that it took 3 years to plan. I started back in 1980, twofold. One was to find storytellers to come to town, because my husband and I really enjoyed storytelling, and we had storytellers here the week of the celebrations. But the other thing that I worked on was getting together a number of bands to come and entertain us the evening of the celebration. And Sudbury had done something like this, and I came from Sudbury and thought I'd steal their idea. So I gathered together people that I thought would be good on it. I had Chief Ciccolone, because I figured the police were going to have to be part of it. I had Don Hyde, who was good friends with the New Black Eagle Jazz Band. I had, at that time, DEC was in town and active, and they had their own big band. And a friend of mine did square dancing. And then the kids figured out some rock and roll band that they wanted to have. So I also involved Gary Watches in the process, because the bands were taking place at Center School. It was a big band. Outside was the under a tent was the square dancing. The basement of St. Isidore's Church was the New Black Eagle Jazz Band, and the kids had their music up at Hale School. And to get between these places was fairly easy, except to Hale. So a bunch of people in town made a trail over there. We put big logs or boards so they could not have to get feet wet. And because the night was going to be a new moon, we strung a bunch of lights, and that's where Gary Watches came over and kindly created a pathway over there. And the committee worked hard for the 3 years, and we decided, I'm wearing it, to create an invite to the party, which some of you probably may still have yours. The center of it is Lori Cattell's design for the town of Stow. No, yeah, not that one. The new one that Lori Cattell did. And then the triangle stood for the 300 years that we had been in progress. We'd made quite a few of these, figuring that we'd have a decent turnout. Well, of course, by the time the dance came, we had to have a special meeting, and Joe Twitchell, who was making the tag board cuts and holes, and the committee that was putting the ribbons on it, we must have met to put 100 or 200 more by the time we got finished. It was well into 500. I wanted to have number 1, but I got 422. But it turned out to be a real success, and the success was the proceeds of it were given to the town to do the walkway between Center School. That was originally funded by the proceeds from the Tricentenary Ball. So I thought you might be interested in that aspect of the celebrations.
Dorothy, could you tell your little story about the parade in 1983 and the floats you were on in the rain?
I was, as I still am, a member of the Stow Historical Society, and we had a float, and someone on that float knew a person that had 2 oxen, and they decided that would be appropriate, and we would head up the parade. And so the guy came, and we met down at the Kroll Plaza, where everybody got on their floats and got ready to go. And since we were representing the oldest organization in town, then we would head up the line, and we would go from the Kroll Plaza up to, I guess it was Pompasiticate. And so the weather was okay at that time, and we started heading west, and the oxen were fine until it started to rain. And Elaine Donahue was doing her spinning wheel, and were you there? Were you on there? Yep. And Mary Warren was there in her costume and mop cap, as were many of us. And when the Great Road started to get wet and a little slippery, the oxen started to get uncomfortable. And so they wanted sure footing, and so they were moving off to the right. And as we were getting up by where the hide place was, there's a little bit of a drop off there. And I was sitting on the right side looking down behind me, and I could see this incline coming closer and closer, and the wagon wheels are getting further over. And so I figured that the handler was going to take his stick and direct the oxen back up, but of course he's one guy and they're two massive. So they kept heading to the right, and it got a little interesting there for a while. So what we did was stop, and under my big skirts I had my video camera with me, and so I started taping all the other floats that were going by, and that film is still someplace, probably at Stow TV. And so that's how we did. We started the parade, and then we ended the parade. But anyway, while I'm talking, I'll talk a little bit more. Phil asked me to describe my position or roles in Stow. We moved here in 1973, my husband Eric and I, and I had come from a background of music, and turned out that I was pretty good with numbers and also editing, and so I took part in editing both Ellie's, Franny's, and Ralph Fuller's books, of which there are samples over there to buy. And Marilyn also brought the magnets, Entering Stow magnets. So you can buy any of those that you'd like to today. Seeing as how I was good with numbers and there came up a need for a treasurer here and there, I volunteered everywhere. Yeah. So I still am treasurer of the Stow Historical Society, and for a while I was treasurer of the Stow Garden Club, the Stow Business Association, and the Stow Conservation Trust. But the Historical Society one continues. Oh, and the Randall Relief Fund and the Randall Town Fund. Can't forget those. So I was going to tell a story about Franny. When you have a home business, as we did, that we had named Test Devices, you need to report to the town clerk and get a DBA, a Doing Business As. And so we wanted to register to vote and also get our DBA. And so I had spoken to Franny on the phone before we moved out from Arlington, and I had told him that we were interested in the property on Packard Road, and could he tell me a little bit about Packard Road? Well, of course, Franny knew everything about everything, so he proceeded to tell me that there wasn't much traffic on Packard Road, except maybe Sunday morning when people were coming down from this new Harvard Acres and coming down Packard Road to get down to St. Isidore's and whatever. Okay, that didn't sound so bad, and he should see it now. Anyway, while he had us there, a captive audience, this is when his office was in the lower level of the town hall, in a little tiny office. And that's where his position was. And so he told me that democracy was like a raft. It got you there, but you got your feet wet. I love that one. And he also told us that he only had 6 jokes. And so it was a good thing new people kept moving into town. I think Jody mentioned, or Phil did, the open barn that Pilot Grove used to have, where people from all over town, especially those with kids, could come and visit the open barn and go right in there, pet the sheep, buy different products that were related to the farm. And it was a wonderful thing until insurance caught up with it, and they were afraid that someone would get harmed by one of the sheep, which was ridiculous, but this is insurance. So that was the end of Open Barn, unfortunately. And speaking of Stan Sherman, Stan and Helga were good friends of ours. And at early Springfest, Eric had been walking down the street and got talking with Stan Sherman, and when Stan found out that Eric had electrical and mechanical background, he mentioned that the Stow Fire Department could really use a new system of some kind, because to call the what are called call fire people, volunteer fire department, we didn't have any full-time back then. Certainly nobody slept over and anything like that. It was just call, and people showed up when they heard the big alarm bell, which I believe is still mounted on the front of the town hall over on the left-hand side. And when people around town would hear that, they would all race to the scene of the fire, because the bell would be put out as so many rings for what section of town, and there weren't that many houses, and so people could figure out where to go. And but as the population grew, that no longer worked. So Eric designed a system of little black boxes that people could put in their bedrooms up by the ceiling or wherever, and it was called plectrons. And when that would go off in the middle of the night, as it did, because of course Eric got roped into being a volunteer fire person, being in Stow all day and all night, so he got roped into that. So the alarm would go off, and at that point everybody would drive to the fire station, and then they would know where to go to the fire. So we both kind of got volunteered into a lot of things. But that's probably enough. Who else?
There's a gentleman over here that I don't know, but you look like an early pioneer.
Yeah.
You have anything to say? Who are you?
I'm Alan Petro.
He was a little kid when I was there.
Yeah. And I may look a little older than I am, but I too have been in Stow for 47 years, so Mosley's got me by a year. But I was born here, as was my father and the family. So West Acton Road.
Is your father William?
No, Alan.
Alan.
Alan as well, yeah.
Did you live on a farm, or just a home, or?
Well, on West Acton Road, there was a farm. They had cows. My great-grandfather had cows, and then my grandfather had horses, and my father didn't want to have anything to do with any of that. And he was a roofer, yep. And now I have alpacas. So, trying. No, Maple Street now. So we're at the town line, Maple and Field. Yep. Exactly.
So you have the alpacas on Maple Road?
That's right.
Okay. I think a lot of us have seen them. Yeah.
I'm Vicki Blake, and I've been here since 1978. And I moved to Lake Boone. And I remember meeting Allison Toole's sister in a play group, and she asked me where I lived. I said, oh, I live on Davis Road in Lake Boone. She said, oh my God, when I was a kid, my mother wouldn't let us go to Lake Boone. That was the bad side of town. Yeah, and Lake Boone was a lot of summer cottages back then, and they have become mostly year-round. But I would also like to mention Stan Sherman. Stan Sherman was kind enough, in 1991, our son was in the 82nd Airborne and was one of the first into Iraq. And that Christmas, Stan Sherman came to our house and interviewed us, and we had a little boy that was about a year old. No, he was 2 years old, and he recited the ABCs, and we sang Merry Christmas and blah, blah, and Stan Sherman sent this tape to our son in Iraq. And it was just a very touching thing that, you know, he didn't have to do. So I remember him very, very fondly. I'm glad he's mentioned here today so much.
Ruth? Eileen, you always have something to say.
Yeah, but I've only been in Stow 10 years. But
I should mention that I've been in Stow for almost 50 years, but I'm still a newcomer because I wasn't born here, so can't do anything about that.
ditto.
Bill or Don? Bill, do you want to say anything about the early years at the mill for your family?
My name's William Byron. My dad used to tell that his family came to Gleasondale section and moved into the house there, one of the mill houses, New Year's Day of 1918. I'm still living in that house. I had three older sisters who were all born in my grandmother's house, which the house she lived in at the time was across the street from the old school lot in Gleasondale. I was born in Marlborough Hospital because I don't know why. I think I have a thought about it, and that was that by then I was the youngest. My mother was, I believe, 36, which at that time was probably considered older to be having children. So anyway, I recall the mill, all the years I've lived there, running day and night, and all the people that lived in the mill houses worked in the mill. My dad worked there for a while, and then I don't know the reason why, but he no longer worked there, and he went to a mill in Garnock, New Hampshire. I have one little thing. You see, my mind is spinning here right now. But one thing I did find in the house recently was some old photographs of apparently a flood in 1926 and a flood in 1936 and the 1938 hurricane, which are kind of interesting to me. The river down there by the mill, when it floods into the mill yard because the mill yard was kind of low to the river. And then in 1955, we had a hurricane through here that again created a flood in the mill yard. And I went out and tried to take photographs of the same locations just for the fun of it. It also affected Main Street in Hudson, where the river runs right through there. I took some pictures there as well. So in 1926 was when my folks got married, and my grandfather apparently moved out of that house and relinquished it to my dad and my mother. I don't know what else I can tell you right off the bat. Talking about paying the rent. Well, of course, the house was rented from the mill, and we had to go down and pay the rent. I think it was weekly. And there was a bridge that crossed the river that some of you may be familiar with, that went into the mill yard. And I occasionally had to carry the rent down there. And I would clutch that $2.50 in my hand so that I would not lose it crossing the bridge and go down the river.
Do you have any stories from your father about working in the mill?
No. There's a lot of rumors that went around. You know, some of the things I'm telling you, some are fact, some might be fiction. I know, I don't think I should relate that story.
Oh, come on.
Well, I'm definitely a newcomer to town, but there's one story that's kind of interesting. We lived in the Philadelphia area and moved here in 1995, and as we were planning to move, my son was taking French horn lessons there. And when his teacher learned that we were moving to Stow, Massachusetts, he said, "You know, that's a very musical town. And this is 300 miles away from here." And I never learned how he knew that there was so much music, particularly the sounds of Stow, here. But it was just so interesting to find that. And of course, the spring season, I was singing in the sounds of Stow in 1996 and have enjoyed it ever since. The other thing that I remember moving here a while after we moved here is finding out that although Lou may be from California at some point, he's very community oriented, and he's the one who introduced things like the silent movie night, either as his birthday or as a part of the Spring Fest or whatever, and I've so much appreciated what he has done for the community. He's really gone out of his way to do that. And at this Spring Fest, you may hear a carousel organ playing, which will be pretty exciting. I don't think you'll miss it. So, thank you. And I should say, I really appreciate Judy has supported Lou in all his various projects. She has put up with a lot.
Dave and I are both members of the Lions Club here, but me for a year and a half, and you for how many years? 4. Oh, I was thinking maybe longer. Do you have any comments about the Lions Club history and?
Well, yeah, the Lions Club celebrated its 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, so it has been here quite a long time, and some of the founding members are still with us. And it's been good that Lou has been able to contribute to the Lions and pull them into some of the projects. So we appreciate it.
How long have you been a member?
The Lions?
Yeah.
About 5 years. Just lately.
Yeah. I see.
So if you want to hear any more about the lower end of town, it's just not Stow proper. My grandmother apparently was somewhat of a midwife person in the village. And also if somebody got hurt, cut, whatever, they would send them to my grandmother to help fix them up. But I wanted to tell you about another person that was born in the house at that time. It was someone that you'd probably know the name of better than my name, and that is Marion Weatherby Fletcher. And several of you may have known. She was born in my grandmother's house as well. And someone is urging me to say that when we were younger, we played pickup, football, baseball, things of that nature. And down by the old church in Gleasondale, there's a field there now that's completely overgrown with trees. And back in the 50s, that's where we played our sports games. The field belonged to a Kenneth Wright, who had a hen farm down there on that property and back. And he allowed us to use the field. And the children that played in the field maintained it. We'd go down there with a reel type push mower and later rotaries when they showed up and mow that field and keep it trimmed so we could play there. And now you can see what happens over time. It's completely overgrown with trees. They did. We played so much sports there, and the balls used to go flying everywhere. So the town actually came down and erected a backstop for us behind home plate. So another things that got done, Daisy, by the town, for the town. They didn't charge us down there for this backstop. They just did it.
Okay, Susan.
I'm Susan Tamker, and I live on Lake Boone since 1984. I was very pleased to hear the names Stan Sherman and Bob Johnson, who were involved in this film. And I worked with both of them at Digital, starting at '84. So I knew them both very well in that context. And that was my original context for knowing them both. Stan, of course, was a character in town that, especially at the town meetings, which others have already spoken about, first running the AV equipment, and then I remember him coming up to the microphone and asking questions that only Stan could ask. And Bob, oh my gosh, Bob was like a brother to me. And all three of us were in the hardware technical writing group at Digital over in Parker Street, in the mill, Parker Street. But at any rate, and Bob and I were managers together for a while, so we had lots of close working projects. And but he was one who was good at recruiting others to help, and so he lassoed me into helping run the church fair for the First Parish Church back in, I think, like '85 or something. That's where I met Liz and Phil. So I didn't realize Bob was at Digital for many years. He wrote a lot of also just common interest or human interest stories for the company. And I think you can see that the writing for this film definitely had his touch to it. Bob was also with the Stow chorus for many years, as was his wife Sandy. And I was just really saddened to hear from Arnie that both of them have passed away. And I knew that Stan had, but I didn't know about Bob and Sandy. So it's a loss to know that Bob is gone.
Great musician.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Incredible musician.
I've got a question. Did DEC have a presence here, a factory or anything?
Yes.
That's why we're here.
Everywhere.
You all work for DEC.
Yeah, raise your hand if you had anything to do with Digital. I mean, it used to be when we'd go to our kids' soccer games, I mean, you'd stand around the sidelines with the other parents and talk about what was going on at Digital. Often learned more about what was going on at Digital at those games than at the company itself. But yeah, I mean, there was the mill that's in Maynard. That was the main headquarters. There was Parker Street, which has now been torn down and is being developed into apartments and retail. the Bose factory was customer service for many, many years. Powder Mill Road, Littleton, Marlboro, Merrimack, Spitbrook Road. Anybody else want to? I mean,
But in the town of Stow, it's only the booze site.
right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I used to think, I had offices all up and down 495, and I'm sure, everyone else here did as well. And I changed jobs every 3 years, but I was with the company for 26, just because there were so many opportunities with the company. So, I mean, it did a lot for a lot of us, and I think it did a lot for the towns around here, too.
Arnie, tell us about yourself.
I don't have anything to say. Those of you who know me are probably glad to forget me, and the rest of you I'll just leave alone.
Some other things to say?
Just to kind of play off what Bill was talking about, the hurricane of 38 at Honey Pot knocked down every single apple that was on every single tree, plus there were many of the trees, so they had to try to rank the trees, and unfortunately that took.
Yeah.
But I moved onto the farm on October 3rd, 1945, and I remember vividly going down to Gleasondale and going into the store down there and buying penny candy where you could fill your hands for a penny, and also going to the Gleasons and listening to story time. So it was some fond memories back in the 1940s.
Oh, sorry.
Here's
When my children were little, say in the late 80s, we would go to Emily Perkins' house, the big yellow house in Gleasondale, and she would have story hour back in the barn behind the house. And then after story hour, she would invite the children to go out to the little gazebo for lemonade and cookies. Great memory for the kids.
Yes.
This lady sitting here, so I saw at least 3 owners, different owners of the store in Gleasondale. But in its later years, Dorothy's father and mother were the ones that ran it and still sold penny candy.
Oh, yes, penny candy. Yes, they would come with a nickel and a quarter, and it may take a half an hour for they figure out what they were gonna buy with that money. And you get 2 for on some things, and they all had, it was a study in economics. And, yeah, it was a little village that existed on the other side of the tracks. And, people worked in the mill, and then the mill went down, but they also came back with Lincoln Canoe, Lazat Plastics, G&G Wire, and Fahey Exhibits, who ran many businesses down there in the mill. And, so it stayed even after the war and the woolen mill was gone. They did burlap for a while, and then they went to other things. My grandfather came here from Rhode Island when my mother was about 4 years old and worked as the fireman at the mill. So he worked there till he was well into his 70s.
Dot.
Yes.
Talk about the safe.
Oh, the safe?
Yeah.
Well, when the post office closed and it was no longer Gleasondale, the story is that Stow didn't want the postal service. So the people in Gleasondale had a Hudson Zip for a number of years, and there was a rural station in Gleasondale. And eventually when they closed the post office, the safe was surplus. So it moved to my basement because I was doing designing and did worked for a number of companies that had security, and I thought I could put the stuff I was working in the safe. And now it's in Craig Martin's basement. It's huge. It was huge. I had to get a rigger from Cavalier to move it, and Craig moved it on Andrew's front-end loader to his basement.
Another cousin of mine.
Yeah.
For Marilyn, so last month, late in the month of March, Marilyn hosted down at the Assabet.
Wildlife refuge. The
Right.
refuge, yeah.
And the subject was about the munitions area down there. And I was hoping that Jim Sauter was going to be here, but something must have come. Could you talk about the essence of that discussion?
Well, the discussion was, well, on the 31st, this was the second time we've done this program. This was slightly different. It's how World War II changed, preparation for World War II changed Stow. The Lower White Pond Road, which now is part of the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge, that was all farm land in Stow, and it went into Sudbury and Maynard, a little bit of Hudson also. Then suddenly, in 1942, the government was literally knocking on people's doors and giving them a mandate that some families had to be out of there within 10 to 12 days. This is their farms. There's many dairy farms down there. Very little explanation. They had to vacate. They're taking the land. And so we have in Stow, we have the Suico Wanateo family. This would be Sylvia Estabrook and her sister Vivian Dean, who is in Maynard. Their family was the very first of all the families in the towns that had to vacate. And it's a very poignant story. And they have been very reluctant. It's very emotional for them even today, because they were little children. They were 5 and 6 when this happened. And so in 2.5 years ago, we went through all of their archives, everything they had, did a tremendous amount of research about trying to find out what happened, what took place. And we have Bill Wickey's family and the Urgatis, that was 3 generations of that house. And Bill came up both times. He came up from Morristown, New Jersey, and to help tell his story. We had also Jim Sauter of Stow, who at that time was a young teenager, and he lived in Hudson, just down the road from the refuge, and he was old enough, just enough older than Bill and Vivian and Sylvia, to have a different perspective. He was a young teenager. He had a band, and he had the commander of the Air Force, or not Air Force, excuse me, U.S. military installation there, stop in unbeknownst that he was the commander, and wanted to know if he could play his guitar with the band. And it was after he played that they found out he was the commander. And so Jim had the wonderful opportunity of having access. He was able to get on the land where it's super high secret. I mean, just nobody was in there. And he had private tours, and so he had some wonderful stories about remembering the blackouts on civil defense as a little kid. Several people told me the stories, how they would have, Bill would be on, or excuse me, Jim would be on bikes. They'd be walking around. They had certain areas in town here. Kids would be on bikes, watching, looking at people's houses to make sure that there were no lights coming out of the houses. A lot of stories of how it changed. It was so secretive that people at this end of town had no idea what was happening on White Pond Road. It happened so fast. And many of these people are also, we had a lot of Finnish and Danish immigrants down there. The Ugatises were Lithuanian. They had a hard time understanding, because of language difficulties, what was happening and what this eviction meant for them. They literally had no help. They had to leave. So it's now on YouTube. Stow TV. If you go to Stow TV YouTube, it's up on YouTube, and it's quite a story of what happened here in Stow. It happened all along the East Coast and West Coast, but when it happens in your town, it makes a big impact. That people just don't realize that there was major changes. But fortunately now we have the wildlife refuge. You can park right at the end of White Pond Road and walk in. You can come in near FEMA and Maynard, or you can go down in Sudbury Hudson up in that way at the visitor center. So we have wonderful access, great flat walking trails. Some of the trails you can have your bikes on them. So it's really, really nice.
Thank you.
Just a little follow-on to Marilyn's account. I learned from the people that owned our farm previously that our farm was a listening site for aircraft, that Ralph Stiles, and the antenna is still up in our barn. It runs the full width of our barn, multiple strands. And so at the same time, there were people listening for any unknown aircraft that might be coming into the area. And he had a little station in our first floor hallway, and that's where he would sit at his desk with headphones and listen to what was, coming in over the airwaves. So that was something that I learned from the women that sold us the farm.
Well, not only that, youth, the children received booklets, and it was in the Maynard paper and the Hudson paper. They had pictures of the different aircraft, the enemy aircraft, and what the enemy aircraft looked like, and what our aircraft looked like. And they were supposed to be watching constantly, watching the aircraft that came over and to report. So I got that from the Trumpolt brothers. I heard that from, and Jim Sauda was talking about that in the Civil Air Patrol, because he was just a little bit older than the others. So it was totally fascinating history that now it seems, now it's getting a long time ago. It doesn't seem that long ago, but it really is a long time ago.
I've got a Civil Air Patrol story myself. Growing up in Port Clinton, Ohio, on Lake Erie, west of Sandusky, east of Toledo, above the waterworks plant down by Lake Erie was a 10-foot by 10-foot room kind of stuck up on the roof. And that's where the Civil Air Patrol went to look out over Lake Erie for incoming Russian airplanes that had flown across from Canada. And in retrospect, I think, what in the world were we doing? Of course, we never saw anything like that. But, we enjoyed our time, and I got to know a lot of airplanes, what they looked like, what they sounded like. So.
Were you near Stow, Ohio?
What?
Were you near Stow, Ohio?
Oh, that's an interesting story. I also grew up in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, and the next town is Stow, and the next town on top of Stow and adjoining it is Hudson.
I think all of the Stows that have been, that we discovered, were 9, I think, in the United States, I believe. I think this is Stow. And I think all of them had either a Berlin or a Hudson adjoining. I could be wrong, but that was it.
Yeah.
And we heard from Stow, Ohio, when on the Centenary, we got a plate from them honoring us.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes.
I'd like to tell you about the past 2 days I had in Stow, what I spent with John Mackey. I was sent to talk to him because we were working on the war memorial in the center. And he had information about the water and the septic and the. So I stopped over and I asked him if he could show me. Oh, sure, he said, come over tomorrow morning. So I went over that morning at 8 o'clock. And I went swamping.
I went through every swamp and in a lot of them. And I
Lost my shoe, which I never got. They were snakes, but he was pointing things. We were looking for the concrete post, and we found two. But John Mackey was probably one of the more gifted storytellers and the most fun to spend a day with. And I made sandwiches. We ate in the swamp. I was soaking wet. I got a rash of some sort afterwards. But it's the one thing I have never regretted doing impulsively, was spending 2 days with John Mackey.
Very good. Well, it's now 3 o'clock, and I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you. Is there any burning statement anybody wants to make? Otherwise, we're adjourned. And just a reminder, again, next month.
May 28th, 1 o'clock, room 122.